Trinity College Dublin, and Catherine Farrell, who is the project manager for the Life on Machair project. There we go, there we are. And really the genesis for this session is that one of the key considerations in drafting the next Biodiversity Action Plan is to significantly strengthen the science evidence base and enhance the accessibility of data. So we really wanted to focus this session on research and data for nature, so that we have the evidence base for the next Biodiversity Action Plan. Now, in the previous Biodiversity Action Plan, the second objective was exactly this, to strengthen the knowledge base for conservation management and sustainable use of biodiversity. We've seen increased third-level research, we've seen increased monitoring, increased assessment that's been necessary in the context of EU directives. We've seen increases in citizen scientists. We have a great platform for biodiversity data, and I'm sure Liam will talk some more about this in terms of the data centre, and this feeds into national and global initiatives. And the national biodiversity indicators allow us to track status and trends in biodiversity, and these are summarised in this excellent publication, which hopefully you've all seen. Liam might speak about that as well. And yet we do still have an issue. We still do have the issue that basic identification and taxonomic skills and knowledge are lacking for many taxonomic groups. This is still true. We still don't have the national land cover map that we've been waiting 3 years for. Habitat diversity at a landscape level is therefore still quite poorly resolved. And these biodiversity data need to be aligned with other environmental data sets so that we can do things like natural capital accounting, and we can start to manage nature in a broader context than just looking at biodiversity. Last year, many of you took part in this meeting that Natural Capital Ireland convened called Data4Nature, and this brought together people to discuss the ways in which data have been collected, collated, and are available. And this conference came up with 5 key recommendations: to develop a central dashboard for Irish nature data, to establish robust protocols, to harmonise formats, to publicise and promote environmental nature data, and to ensure open and equal access for all to data sets. And also last year, so that's from the data side of things, last year from the research side of things, the All-Ireland Climate and Biodiversity Research Network was launched. And this brings together a wide range of researchers from across the island of Ireland who are undertaking research in climate and biodiversity to address key challenges in climate science, climate mitigation and adaptation, in terms of biodiversity change, and in terms of social just transition. But the launch of this network also highlighted the need for funding, the need for sufficient resources to be able to mobilise this network and make the most out of these researchers coming together. So where do we go in the next Biodiversity Action Plan? And really, a lot of the focus of the meeting over these 2 days is on the next Biodiversity Action Plan. So the objectives of the session today really are to identify where we have research and data gaps, to highlight these challenges that were mentioned in the Data4Nature report last year, to explore approaches to collaboration, to partnership, to transdisciplinary research, and to make some recommendations to ensure that the evidence base is strong enough to inform decision making for biodiversity conservation and restoration. So what we want to do in this session is we have 4 speakers, and they will each have 10 minutes to give a presentation. We then will have a short period of time for questions for those speakers, both online. So for those of us joining online, if you'd like to put questions into the Q&A, and questions from the floor here. And then we have 3 panelists who we will spend some time speaking to at the end of the session. We need to finish up at 5 to 5 in order that you've got time to run down to the plenary for the start of the next session. So without further ado then, I'll introduce my co-chair, Catherine Farrell, who's going to introduce the first speaker.
Yes, and I suppose one of the things that just struck me in terms of when we started the Encase project, which started actually about 3 years ago. So it's Irish Natural Capital Accounting. You're going to hear a lot of the findings from that work here today. along with our other colleagues. But it was really about sharing findings, we worked with so many variety of colleagues and people who had a shared interest to act for nature. And that the data really underpins reliable accounting, and that can't be, you're really, because what gets measured gets managed to better effect. And that was the mantra that kept coming through at all of our engagements, that you can't manage what we don't know about. And it came through in the last session as well in terms of the coastal and the marine. So it's one of the underlying themes that we'll be teasing out. And it also came up in the opening session where Andy Bleasdale highlighted the strategic nature project that they're developing, the SNAPS project, but also Ciara Carberry highlighted data management being a critical component, but also data share and access for everyone to data, because we all want to develop our research, but also develop our actions as well. So to enable and support what we're doing. So without further ado, I have the great honour of introducing friend and Dr. Liam Lysaght, who's the Centre Director for the National Biodiversity Data Centre. He's responsible for setting the strategic direction of the data centre, the overall management of the operations and work programme, and building partnerships with other organisations, which I have to say he does really, really well. He's excellent at that role. He's an avid biodiversity recorder, and I'm watching him all the time on Twitter with the wonderful things that he's recording and showing us. And he serves as the head of delegation for Ireland to the Global Biodiversity Information Facility, and he's here today to talk about his own work. And thank you and welcome, Liam.
Thanks, Jane, and thanks, Catherine. You left that hanging. You said I was a friend, and you moved quickly on. I was intrigued to know what was the second part of that, but listen. Thank you very much for that. I'm delighted to be here, and it's great. It's a great conference so far, and it's really nice to have a topic, a session focused on data and data needs to inform policy. The starting point really for my presentation is to build on the work of the report that was done, the Data4Nature report that was done last number of months. It was really good to have a workshop and a focus on the data needs for research and for science. So I want to to build on that really and see how we can progress that further. I suppose one of the things I think that it's not necessarily, it's an observation I have about that report is that perhaps first of all, it was a small bit too generic in terms of that there are different data types that are needed, and I suspect a drilling down of what the different data types would have been quite helpful, and I think we can expand on that. And the other question is, I wonder, was there an in-depth enough critique of where the issues and the problems were? So they're the two topics that I'd like to just address. So from my perspective, I think in terms of the biodiversity data for research needs, they occur in at least three different kind of components. One is biodiversity data. It's basically what species do we have, how are they distributed, where do they occur, and how are they changing. I think they're core biodiversity data needs. There's also then, for research purposes and understand ecosystem functions, there's all that data and research needed around ecosystem function. And then thirdly, there's what I would call broader environmental data, and that's where biodiversity data overlaps with broader environmental data. So there's at least those three legs to the stool. And what I want to do is focus just on the first one, just to concentrate. If we could get our biodiversity data right, I think we're in a better position then to know what the issue is when we try to bring in other data, other types of data for research purposes and the like. So I was asked to talk, the data centre seems to be synonymous with citizen science. We actually do a lot more than citizen science, but I think it's important to talk about data types. People seem to be confused what citizen science is. There are 10 principles to citizen science. These have been developed by the European Citizen Science Association. And just to say that citizen science projects have a genuine scientific outcome. This is one of the principles. Another one is citizen science is considered a research project like any other, with limitations and biases, and that these should be considered and controlled for. And another one of the principles I just want to highlight is that citizen science programs need to be evaluated for their scientific output, data quality, participant experience, and wider societal and policy impact. So basically, any good data science, citizen science, it needs to be collected to a set of standards, it needs to be validated, and its limitations need to be understood. If this bedrock is carried out, if the approach is adopted, you have good quality data. And in this regard, there's no difference between citizen science data and research data. So there's a false dichotomy initially, I think, being presented. You have good quality data if it's collected properly. And it's only that the subject matter might be somewhat different. So I just want to try to explain then in terms of kind of from the biodiversity data side that we already have an exercise and a framework where we've done a kind of a knowledge base, overview of the state of knowledge on Ireland's biodiversity for 2010. So we brought taxonomic experts together and we looked at what species we have, knowledge on what species we have, knowledge on how they are distributed and how they are changing. We brought the experts together and we asked them all for their taxonomic group. We asked them the following questions. Is there a published checklist? Do we know what species occur in Ireland? Has a basic survey been carried out? Is there a national database? Has a national conservation assessment been completed? Are there monitoring systems in place? Are there capacity building requirements to improve the state of play? And are there other knowledge gaps? So we brought all the leading lights together into a room and asked them to do this exercise for us. And through this process, we actually produced a state of knowledge on the state of biodiversity in 2010. And as part of this, for each of the taxonomic groups, biodiversity taxonomic groups, we came up with a table looking at the number of species known for that group, the estimated number of species. Is there a taxonomic checklist? Was there a basic survey carried out? Do we have a national database? And is there an Irish expert? So we have done this for all the different taxonomic groups, and we've produced that overview of the state of knowledge. Now, this is in 2010, and it allowed us to identify where the knowledge gaps were, and we did identify a few gaps. The challenge, I think, is for us to repeat that exercise now, 13 years later, to see if the state of knowledge has progressed. We've also put this information onto a web page because we wanted to make all of the things we do in the data centre, we want to make information and data as freely available as possible. So we have a website, it's the Biodiversity Inventory, and this is what it looks like for the groups to deal with insects, the Irish checklist, and then we've itemised each of the data sets, the sources of distributional data for the different taxonomic groups. And if, for example, you click on the carrion beetles of Ireland, which is a data set produced by the National Museum, that data set is published through Biodiversity Maps. And with that, you have all the metadata associated with the data set, which is absolutely critical. You can access the data. You can see that it's either available, we've two licensing type. Either the data is open data so people can download it and use it directly for research purposes, or else it's restricted. So it shows that the data, it acts like a shop window. You know the data is there, you know, you have some sense of what's in the data set, but you have to go to the data provider to get the data if you wish. This system is developed to the international best practice. It conforms to the Darwin Core, and it conforms with the Global Biodiversity Information Informatics infrastructure. So it's a state-of-the-art system. And this is what it looks like, biodiversity maps. You can see at the top corner there are now in excess of 5 million records in it. There's 171 different data sets, and there's something like 35 different data providers. And the key thing is this is a platform for bringing data together to using common standards to a common platform. And data are provided by state agencies, NGOs, researchers, national experts, and some of the environmental NGOs. So we have a platform here that I would argue is fit for purpose. But also, that's only a tool, really. We have a data framework in operation and a data flow. I don't want to go through this in detail, other than say that we have an ability to capture data from in the field, or we have data that can be validated We have data sets that can be provided by researchers or state bodies or whoever, and these are then published into the validated database, which is biodiversity maps. And as you can see then, the key thing is about making the data freely available and easily accessible for uses to which it comes. For us, data is only the starting point. We want the data to be used. So the data is available for red lists, it's available for conservation management, it's a rate for planning, and then through the GBIF portal, the data is available for research purposes. So this is an infrastructure, and it's a data flow that's available. It's a public service. It's been funded by the Heritage Council and the National Parks and Wildlife, and it's a system here. It's a shared service that anyone can use to improve the amount and accessibility of data to inform research and other uses. So basically, to come back to the key 5 recommendations for the Data4Nature, so the 5 recommendations were to develop a central dashboard for Irish nature data, to establish robust data gathering protocols, to harmonise formats, publicise and promote, and ensure open and equal access. I would argue that for biodiversity data, now this is key, for biodiversity data, we actually have a central dashboard that needs to be used. We have established data gathering protocols. All of the data goes through validation processes. We have a harmonised format. It's used the Darwin Core. This is the international standard for biodiversity data. The data is freely available with all the accreditations that are necessary and citation systems built into it. And we're promoting as the open and equal access to data so that we're actually building a resource for the research community as well as anyone else. So I would argue within biodiversity maps, we actually have that platform in place. So again, just to labour the point, is that I think we have a central dashboard for biodiversity data already, which meets many of the open data management best practices. Does it need better uptake? Absolutely. And do we need to extend it to include new data types? Absolutely. But let's be clear, and this is where I come back to critiquing of what the issues are. From my perspective, what's lacking is we need it to be properly resourced, right? If you don't have, resources isn't everything, but if it's not properly resourced, you can't expand and develop. Our funding has remained static for 5 years. We need better institutional buy-in. And what I mean, that's me being diplomatic. What I mean is that there's a lot of talk this morning about ICT systems, about better data management. We are here, we're funded by the state. We have a system that I think is fit for purpose. I'm surprised that people aren't coming to talk to us to see how we can help other organisations to actually help deliver. Now, maybe we can't, but at least get that dialogue going. There's a huge need there, and I think we have to stop being so territorial. I think that's me. I'm 10 minutes. Thanks very much.
Thanks very much, Liam, and I think that's really important points there on biodiversity data and the excellent job that the National Biodiversity Data Centre is doing. So thank you very much. Our next speaker, I'm delighted to introduce Dr. Aoife Delaney, who works in NPWS. She joined as a coastal ecologist in 2019, and she now coordinates the monitoring activities in the Science and Biodiversity Unit. Prior to that, she carried out habitat monitoring as an ecological consultant, so she has experience in the private sector. And she came back to academia, did a PhD with me in Trinity, where she pursued interests in human impacts on natural systems. And she's also worked in Irish systems, tropical systems, all over the place. So Aoife, it's wonderful to welcome you to speak this afternoon.
Thank you very much, Jane. It's nice to be here. So I'm going to give you, let me just experiment slightly with the slides. Excellent. I'm going to give you a very shallow and quick overview of some aspects of the biodiversity data we have in Ireland. So starting out, we monitor for loads of reasons, either out of scientific curiosity or because we want to know about the integrity of an ecosystem. Sometimes we want to inform policy and decision making, or it might just be about legal requirements. Just a flag about legal requirements, that can lead to gappy data if that's what we're very focused on. So depending on why we're monitoring, we make choices about how to monitor. We might be specifically looking at species records, For a complex system like a habitat, we might take proxy data, so indicator species that tell us information about the general system's health. Or we might be interested, and this is really important for informing decision-making and policy, we might be interested in the abiotic and biotic factors that drive biodiversity. So that's a whole heap of different kinds of data. And it's recorded by a really wide range of organizations across the state in different sectors. In the public sector, for example, we have a huge number of agencies recording abiotic data like the EPA or mapping data like the OSI. We have in NPWS a lot of species records. I'm going to focus in on NPWS as an example, and it's also because it's my department, my section. We are in the Department of Housing, but we record biological data and we have a major focus on working to service legislation, specifically the Birds and Habitats Directives. So we need to record every 6 years quite a lot of data about the national status of a huge number of habitats and species. And that means that we need to take on private consultants, ecological consultants in the private sector to help us, which can cause bottlenecks because they're quite specialized and we're all seeking the same people to do the jobs for us. We also have our own staff. We have fantastic regional staff who record, for example, pressures and threats at our own sites. So when the data come in, in our contracts that we send out, we ensure that we have data standards written into those contracts. And when the data come in, we then have to check those data, we have to process them, and then we try to make them available online. And that's the ultimate aim, that everything we have legally can be made available is made available. So this is our web page, our maps and data page, which is where you would go if you wanted to, for example, use a viewer to see the boundaries of the protected sites in Ireland, or if you want to click on a project and download the shapefiles and the tabular data that project has generated, this is where you go. If you want to find information about a sensitive species, you can always make a data access request. Now this webpage is possibly the best kept biological secret in Ireland. People often don't know about it, so that's a point as well. The data are there, but we need to access them. In terms of the private sector, I've already mentioned that documents like this that we publish in NPWS are often informed by national surveys by specialist ecologists. But ecologists also work for local authorities, and a huge amount of their work is based on appropriate assessment and ecological impact assessments. And this is really important because those data often end up being presented in a PDF, either as tabular data at the back in an appendix or as a summary. And it's really hard to access those data to reuse them. So given the huge effort that goes into this, it would be great to have access to those data for monitoring. So the academic sector is very different. They have smaller data sets like teaching data sets. If somebody does the same field season or field trip with their undergrads every single year, they can build up data that can be published. But a lot of work is done on targeted research over 4 to 6 years, answering specific questions, and they may not always be good for long-term monitoring data sets. But the academic sector also does engage in long-term monitoring. For example, the pasture experiments at Lyons Farm carried out by UCD, or this buoy, which will in the future record information about the marine environment in Brandon Bay that NUIG is using. And then we have this NGOs and other. So there are lots of other organizations. For example, the Botanical Society of Britain and Ireland, they're an NGO whose raison d'etre is to record plant records. Then there are projects like European innovation projects and life projects who record data, as well as amateurs, people who just do it for the love and can be very, very expert. The degree of sharing and accessibility of all of these data is really linked to the individuals and the organizations who are collecting it, so it's quite heterogeneous. If we want to make the best of these data sets, we need to be able to work together and bring them together and collaborate. So the way we monitor habitats for Article 17 of the Habitats Directive is a good example of how we can do this. We in NPWS, we engage with our partners in the National Biodiversity Data Centre and academia to get data in. We also contract ecologists. They might be collaborating among themselves to share data. And when we get those data in, we then process them and make them available to all of our partners in return. But we also send data out for specific reasons. For example, we send information to the EPA so they can incorporate that into the Water Framework Directive reporting. There are challenges, though. The data can be fragmented across lots of different organizations. They're not always extremely accessible because we don't know, for example, that they're there or where to look for them, even if they are being presented. Data sharing is difficult sometimes if you have data which has personal information or which is a little bit politically sensitive. And raw data isn't always presented in an accessible format. It might not get even to a publication. So we also have data gaps, and Liam has covered some of these. We don't record important genetic data, some of our services from nature, and the monitoring targets can be limited. For example, soil invertebrates are often missed out. And we also need to look beyond records. We have a really good centre that's taking record data, but we don't have as good a collection of shapefiles, for example, spatial data. And if we don't have all of these freely available, it's hard to use them in decision making. In future, we're going to have to be able to mine data. We're going to have to be able to incorporate data from new types of technology, for example, acoustics. We need to consider how we can bring our monitoring data in to support monitoring measures and to see how successful measures have been. And we also need to think about how we can have a really, really efficient mechanism to get information from the data collectors to inform policy right across the board. So we have some useful tools. Jane's already mentioned the Climate and Biodiversity Research Network, which NPWS supports. We also support Biodiversity, which will be a fund specifically for monitoring data. Please apply. We also have tools like the FAIR principles for recording data that can help us to standardize our approaches and will hopefully guide us towards building upon existing public platforms. As Liam has said, they're out there, we can use them. But we'll hear this every single session today, I think. We need more capacity, we need more ecologists, we need more expertise, we need more data scientists, we need people to be able to upskill throughout their career, and we need more resources, we need infrastructure, and we need technology that we can deploy. And on that note, I will leave you. Thank you very much.
Okay, so our next speaker, I'm delighted to welcome friend and colleague Liam. That's what I was going to say. I could have said drinking buddy, but you know, it's been a while. So Lisa is currently a PhD student in the Department of Geography at NUIG, working as part of the REPEAT project, looking at peatland, land use change and mapping. So before this, she worked with me. I have to say she's excellent. She's brilliant at her work. She worked as a GIS analyst on the NCASE project, and she's going to tell us about some of the findings from that today. So welcome, Lisa.
Thanks for the introduction, Catherine. That was very flattering. I feel like you're looking for something else off me now. So yeah, I'm going to talk a bit about NCASE today, and particularly align and data and spatial data in particular for natural capital accounting. And I didn't realise Liam was going to be talking about the Data4Nature report as well, so I may possibly skip over that little section, but yeah. So first, what actually is natural capital accounting? So it's a system for organising stocks and flows of natural capital, and it's a process that has become an international standard and one that we'll be obliged to implement nationally. So on NCASE, we're using the UN SIA ecosystem accounting approach to model accounts for 4 catchments around Ireland. So this is the SIA data gathering model, and it helps align our approach to data gathering. So it's a very data hungry approach because it requires data on ecosystem extent, conditions, services and benefits. And up until the NCASE project, there had been no organised or coherent approach to natural capital accounting in Ireland, except recently the CSO have released sectoral accounts. So initiating natural capital was an action mentioned in the last National Biodiversity Action Plan as an action to be implemented, but natural capital accounting is about more than just biodiversity. So it's just one aspect of natural capital, and it's actually included in extent and in services. So NCASE stands for Irish Natural Capital Accounting for Sustainable Environments, and it's an EPA-funded project piloting natural capital accounting at a catchment scale in Ireland. And it's an interdisciplinary project with ecologists, economists and natural capital experts in Ireland, as well as SIA EA experts in Australia. So as I said, we're looking at 4 catchments around Ireland. So we have the Carra catchment, which is in Kerry, the Bride catchment, which is in Cork, the Dargle, which is in South Dublin and North Wicklow, and then the Fidgel, which is in Offaly and Kildare. And these are Corrine land cover maps, and looking at them, you can see how varied the land cover is in the catchments, with the Bride dominated by agriculture, which is all the areas of yellow, and then the Carra and Fidgel having significant areas of wetlands, which are blue, and then the Dargle, a mixture of forestry, wetlands, agriculture, and urban areas. So on the project, we've been in contact with or used data from a variety of agencies, some of which I've listed here to give you an idea of the diversity of data required for the project, and thanks to everyone who has provided us with data. But as you can probably imagine, there are challenges with combining or looking at data sets holistically. So biodiversity data already has a good platform in Ireland, as Liam explained, but it needs proper support, and data sets produced aren't necessarily aligned with other environmental data sets. So our first challenge was actually gathering and finding the data. So this was a challenge often because even though data sets were listed as open source, we couldn't actually find the data set, or there were metadata issues with it. So this often resulted in us having to go directly to the data provider themselves, even if the data was open source. And it highlighted the need for all data for the natural capital accounting approach to be available in the one location. The next challenge was the coverage of spatial data. So some of the data sets we used were available for all 4 of our catchments, and others were only available for part of a catchment. So this meant that when we were looking at ecosystems across the catchments, it was difficult to compare or ecosystems or condition of them. We used data from almost 40 agencies, which means that there were several different coordinate systems used, different resolutions, and different minimum mapping units. And this often meant that more work than necessary was required in order to compare or look at the data sets. The data from multiple agencies also means that there was often different time series used for each agency's data collection. So some of the data sets we used were collected annually, others every 3 years, or maybe every 5 years. And this meant that looking at natural capital accounting for a specific year could be quite challenging. Data gaps are one of the main challenges we encountered. And we found that the majority of data gaps are in terms of ecosystem condition, where very little data was collected. And often when data was available for condition, it was only released aggregated to a national scale. And as well as this, there's no comprehensive ecosystem map of Ireland, and we're still waiting on the OSI EPA land cover map, but hopefully that would help to fill in some of the data gaps we encountered. Working at a catchment level itself has also proven to be difficult, and this is because very few agencies report or collect data for a catchment scale. So anything reported for Irish census boundaries, for example, don't match up with the catchment boundaries and can't be disaggregated. So this was particularly evident in terms of services, where figures for population, apologies, water provision or livestock are reported for census boundaries. However, I just want to say that while there are challenges with the data, it doesn't mean that natural capital can't be done, and we prove this with the work we've done on InCase, while also highlighting how data collection needs to be focused in certain areas of extent, condition, services and benefits in order to fill in the data gaps. So the integration of data sets can help to fill data gaps and can result in very different outcomes. And an example of this would be in terms of woodland and forestry, apologies, for one of our catchments. Yeah, thank you, sorry. So on the left is a map of the Corrine forestry classifications in the Dargle catchment, and on the right is a map when additional forest and woodland classifications were added in, the likes of Article 17 data. And this had a significant effect because the tree cover area in the catchment increased by almost 23%, from 18 to almost 41%, highlighting the need for the gathering of as many relevant data sets as possible. So my next bit was about the Data4Nature workshop, which Liam pretty much covered, so I might skip on so you can get to the questions. But here are some links that are about InCase, some of the papers we published, and then also Natural Capital Ireland and the Data4Nature report. Thank you.
much, Lisa, and thanks for all your excellent work on the In-Case project and for buying us back a bit of time in this packed session. So thank you for that. So our last speaker then in this session is my colleague, Dr. John Connolly, who's the Kinseller Assistant Professor in GIS and Remote Sensing in Trinity. So Don is a physical geographer and leads a number of projects that are funded through the EPA and Department of Agriculture, and he really champions the use of using GIS and remote sensing to refine our understanding of land use change, and particularly carbon dynamics of the landscape. So John, we'll hand over to you. Thank you.
Oh, that's not it though. That's something else. Will I go again?
Just have to mine it, John.
Okay. This isn't my presentation. It looks like a document. Yeah. I don't usually have so much text in my presentations. Sorry? Okay, so hello everybody. My name is John, and I have been working on mapping peatlands and land use in Ireland for the last 20 odd years. So this is kind of technical issues. Oh, okay. All right. Okay. I can give a quick overview of my presentation. I'll try and do it without my slides, although I'm a very visual person. Being a geographer, imagery is really key to what I do. But anyway, so I'm really interested in using tools like GIS, which is Geographic Information Systems, which is basically computer mapping. All of you in the room have used GIS, even if you don't know you have. If anybody has used Google Maps, you've used GIS, okay? Also, I use satellite data to look at the landscape and to look at land use over time. So as a GIS person and a remote sensing person who's worked in this area for about 25 years, we've noticed this massive change over time in the amount of data that's available to us. So when I started working with GIS and remote sensing, you had a computer that was probably as big as this, this desk here, big, huge monitors, really, really clunky, not very powerful, and all that has changed. Okay, so we have like screens like this little, screen here, and these really nice thin screens here to work on. But also we see these massive changes in the data that we have. So the first satellite, the first commercially available satellite was launched in 1972, 50 years ago today, and that's the Lysaght satellite. It produces data at 30-meter resolution, which is probably about, this room is probably about 10 meters long, so it's 30 meters is what, 30 by 30 meters basically. So we use that data to look at how the land use is changing over time. And the brilliant thing about the Lysaght satellite is that we have this long time, maybe 50 years of data now, which is absolutely fantastic. So it's used for monitoring change in the Amazon rainforest. It's used for monitoring the environment all over the world. Okay, and when that satellite was launched, there wasn't many other satellites. Okay, and the data was really clunky to get. It was really awkward to access. And we've gone through this kind of geospatial revolution where now we have a huge number of satellites orbiting the Earth, They produce imagery at everything from sub-meter, so you can get an image that you could basically see the people in this room, more or less, which is a huge advance, and it gives us the ability to look at and study the environment in a much deeper way, and we can gain a deeper understanding of the dynamics that we see in the environment. During that time, we've also seen a big change in new technology. So we have now drones that we're able to deploy in the field and acquire data at between 5 and 10 centimeters. So using that data, we can then look at really, really detailed habitats. So one of the projects that we're working on is called iHabimap. It's a project that's funded by the EPA, and we're looking at annex habitats in the Machaires, in the dune systems there. We're using a huge range of techniques to study the data. So we're using classification techniques, and we're using machine learning techniques. And the machine learning techniques are really, really useful because you can train the data using, we're working very, very closely with several ecologists who are really, really informing us, and we're telling them, we're kind of moving into this new sphere where there has to be communication between the experts, okay? So there has to be really good communication with us, to the ecologists telling us what's on the ground as remote sensors, but also with this new way of working with the data using machine learning, we have to be able to inform the ecologists. So ecologists will come to us and they go, we've sampled 100 points, so here's the data. And we go, no, we need like 1 million points. So, because you have to have a huge amount of data to inform the models. So there's a big conversation between us and the ecologists on how to acquire that data. And there's different techniques that we can use, data augmentation. So you might have a site that has 100 points, and if you rotate it a certain way and then extract the data again, you're using the same data but from a different rotation, and you're including that in the machine learning models. And the results that we have, which we don't have, give us really, really accurate maps. So the maps that we're coming out with in the Machaires, which you might be very excited about, are coming out at 93% accurate. And that's really, really high accuracy. So that means that these techniques can then possibly be rolled out in the future at our test sites in the Machaires and Bull Island and a few other sites around Ireland, but they can be rolled out to look at other environments. Okay, and the national, the Habitats Directive reporting that Aoife was talking about a few minutes ago is done by ecologists on very small sections of vast areas. So for example, if they're looking at peatlands, they'll go to a particular location and they'll say the peatlands are of this health. But the problem is what's going on in the rest of the areas. And that's where this kind of spatial data, the satellite imagery, the drone data can come in and help us to inform, to refine our knowledge of those areas and to bring that knowledge back. And then it goes into policy, and we can, target if there's degradation happening in different locations. Another tool that we are using is Sentinel satellites. These were launched by the European Space Agency in 2015. The spatial resolution is 10 meters, so it's not as good as the drones, but what it does give us is it gives us data. I think the satellite's return time is every 2.5 days, so we can get almost 3 data points a week if it's not cloudy. The clouds is a massive issue for remote sensing in Ireland, but hopefully we're moving into getting some radar data to help us solve those issues. But what we can do then is we can build up these time series, and we can look at the environment and how it's changing over time, using the signals that are coming back from the satellite data. So for example, one of my PhD students is working on a project called SmartBog, and we're building up he's gone back to 1990 to look at land use on peatlands. 1990 as a kind of baseline. year, he's looked at 2015, he's looking at 2005, and he's looked at 2020. So it's this time series over a 15-year gap. So we've got 3 data points. And the data that he's pulling out now, you're seeing these big land use changes, particularly on the Borden peatlands, which have come out of production. And we're able to monitor how those are changing over time. So we're seeing forestry coming into areas. We're seeing areas that are being re-wetted. We're seeing natural vegetation and scrubland coming into other areas. And these are areas that are, so we're looking at areas, well, his maps are for the entire country, for peatlands in the entire country. But if you just look at the Borden land holding, it's about 80,000 hectares. So to be able to monitor that for somebody on the ground, that's very difficult to do unless you have a huge number of ecologists on the ground, but you can do it using remote sensing. So my brain is just going back to remember what I was talking about in my talk. How much time do I have left? I just have one more quick point to make. So these satellites, the NASA satellites and the Sentinel satellites, are recording 12 terabytes of data a day. It's a huge amount of data. In the past, we had a real issue around actually getting data. Now we've so much data that we need to, like you were saying, that we need to develop the capacity. We need to have people who are able to analyze these data sets. So that's me there.
I think you can tell by John's ability to ad-lib a number of slides that he's absolutely passionate about his work, and he has really led our understanding and deeper awareness of peatlands in this country particularly. So I have to commend you for your expertise, but also your ad-libbing without slides. He's also a friend, and I can say probably a drinking buddy as well. So anyway, when we used to do all that. So what we're going to do now is we have sort of like to provoke some questions and discussions. We have a question for each of our speakers. And then if time allows, we will have a question from the floor, but we are quite tight to time. We have to close at 5 to 5 because our colleague from IPES is going to present to us in the main hall, so we need to get back for that. So we're going to keep it tight. And so we'll have one question for each of you, and then we'll try and open to the floor. And then we're going to have a panelist session. We will be joined by some further colleagues. So I suppose the first thing for you, Liam, and this seems like, you know, some of the things that we've talked about over the years is, you know, the role of the data centre. And I think to me, you really highlighted the challenges, and you almost got to some solutions, and I feel we could probably, you know, might give you the opportunity to mention some of those solutions. But one of the ones that spoke to me was that more integrated approach I sensed between the National Biodiversity Data Centre and the National Parks and Wildlife Service that we talked a lot today about, and this morning collectively, about data management and data transfer. So do you want to speak to that point, Liam? Just, I mean, there's a microphone in front of you, so you can. No, you don't have very long, but keep it tight, as the lad says.
I suppose really to be succinct on this, there's an awful lot of work happening out there on data, and John, you said it. I mean, the amount of data management has become a bigger issue than often data availability. There's a lot of work happening. Some of us are doing good work, some of us are doing poor work, some of us are doing good and bad work. But really what's missing, I think, is some kind of a strategic approach to data management at the national level. I think it's crying out. And, you know, you see initiatives happening, and they're meeting a need. They're really good, some of them, and then the funding stops or something, and then you're starting the same cycle over again, or you're almost coming to a solution, and then something happens, some change jobs, and you're back to square one. And if there's anything that the National Biodiversity Action Plan, the 4th iteration of it, can do, is to identify some, knock heads together and come up with a national strategy where we can start pooling our resources and we can make data available. And we hear an awful lot about we need to do this and we should be doing it. Let's do it. But we need central government to take the role in it, even if it's only empowering us. We need someone to step up and actually take the action. The key thing about biodiversity, it's probably the most data-driven policy. Either biodiversity is improving or it's not. it has to be underpinned by good quantitative data and time series data, and we need to produce the evidence. So one plea I'd make is let us go out of this room trying to knock heads together and collaborate rather than pulling against each other.
And sorry, Liam, just to follow on from that, do you think that that has to be led by a state body?
Well, it has to be. The imprimatur has to be coming from the Department of Heritage, Local Government, and whatever you are. for you'll never move again. By the way, it just but I think it has to be led because the policy is embedded within this department. Now, it may well. I mean, the data centre could well be empowered to take that leading role. But it's the department that has to actually empower people and commit to supporting those of us who are working in the sector.
I think that's a very strong message, and I think it was probably reflected through the different presentations. Aoife, just coming to you, and John spoke a bit about the monitoring side of it as well. I mean, one of the criticisms that you probably come across a lot is that, we're reporting these negative trends all the time, but how do we actually use this data to support action? So we're talking about act for nature. So how can you see that being translated into action?
I had a slide that I thought was too negative in my talk before, where I said moving on from monitoring loss, which is how we felt a lot of the time as ecological consultants, that we monitored and it was always loss. But things are changing, so there are a few things that we're doing at the moment. For one thing, we have a new measures team in place in NPWS, and we can communicate internally now between the group of us who take on the monitoring information and have been taking that on for a long time. We now have an official outlet with whom we can discuss turning that into change for the better. They're quite newly in place, so that's quite embryonic. But we have historically been taking information over the last, say, 5 years and working towards developing projects on the basis of monitoring information at a national scale. So, for example, your own project, Life on Machair, myself and Sean Kelly were aware of problems from monitoring data that had been reported at a national scale relating to biodiversity, certain types of farming, and particularly issues on breeding waders, for example, and pollinators. So that was data that has been used from the monitoring teams to have a positive effect. It's only at 9 sites for the moment, but we're hoping that that'll inform national policies. But also in future, Andy mentioned the SNAP application, so the Strategic Nature, I forgot the name of it. SNAP, we just call it SNAP. So the aim for that is to consolidate our data in such a way that it is available and more easily usable, I suppose, for everybody who's involved in measures and in biodiversity in the future.
Okay, and I suppose, and I know you're listening to this conversation, and I know you're all dying to chomp at the bit, and please free to, grab these people when they walk out the door, but as I said, the time is limited. John, you talked about remote sensing and AI, and, one of the things that it's always come to mind, is this down the road? Can we actually use this now, or what's our lead-in time to actually make better use of remote sensing and AI data? I mean, is it now or is it in 10 years' time?
Well, we have the data available now, we have the techniques now. I think it's really a capacity issue. So having so with AI, I'm more talking about, that's a kind of artificial intelligence, I'm more talking about machine learning. So we have the capacity now, we're developing the techniques in some of our projects that will help to, so we're working on developing algorithms to assess the data that comes out of drones so that we can use these kind of automatic classification techniques. So when the drone flies over here that records the data, that's only kind of step one in the process of actually pulling information out of the image. So you have to go through a kind of pre-processing and classification and all these kind of things, and then you end up with a map of the area. So I think we have, we're working in those areas. We have the information, we have the data, and it's really, I think, around a capacity issue, around building the, for us in the university sector, maybe training up graduates who can start to move out and use these data, and produce the results from them. So I don't think it's a future thing. I think it's you know, we have the data now. We're in the process of training undergraduate students to be able to access this data, so and to use it.
Yeah, no, that's really encouraging, but I suppose it's one of the things in our own conversations, it's capacity. And I think that'll probably come up in the second part of our session as well. And Lisa, you know, I mean, you've, you know, we went through several data sets, and, you know, if you had one takeaway in terms of data share, or, you know, having gone through several data share agreements, having gone through several data providers or gatherers, what would be the key learning for you, or the recommendation as someone who needed the data and needed to use it, you know, for
I can think of multiple answers to this, to be honest with you. I think really importantly is to have the end users at mind from the very start of gathering the data, and that's primary and secondary uses of data. So often data sets are collected for a particular purpose without the realisation that they can be used for different needs. And also for governmental bodies, I think one common data share agreement would be really useful. They're all data share agreements are pretty much asking you for the same thing, but half the time it's understanding what they're asking and spend the time to actually fill it out. Like one of ours actually had to go through the Trinity legal department for like a research project, which I think is a bit ridiculous, to make sure that we filled it out right. So yeah, I think it would be to talk to each other.
That's great. And so we're going to allow you to stand down, please, colleagues, and we're going to invite up our next three panellists. And I'm going to introduce them as they're walking up. Yeah?
Sorry, there's just a comment, a question in the chat there. So
Yeah.
can I
Oh yeah, read it out there, yeah. Go on.
So we just have a question in here. Biodiversity data recording is vital. Thank you, Justin Ivory, for this question. But there is a need to firstly map actions that individuals, local communities, etc. are taking for biodiversity, record the benefits of those actions on an ongoing basis, and thirdly, enable local communities to easily produce their own mapping systems to drive local projects and actions. So I think that's a really useful comment. Thank you, Justin, for the question. He asked, does the panel agree or have any thoughts? If you have agreements or thoughts, please come back to the online platform and put them into the chat. So thank you very much.
Great, yeah, I think that really goes back to about us tracking what we actually do. So I'm going to invite you all up. Aoife Wemaere, Senior Manager of the EPA Research Programme. She's been working in the EPA for the last 18 years, leading the EPA Research Programme. Anyone working on research knows this woman as the person to, you know, we're going to get the research grant. Also, National Contact Point for Horizon Europe, Cluster 6, Food, Bioeconomy, Natural Resources, Agriculture and Environment, as well as for Biodiversity plus European Partnership, Horizon Europe EC programme. She's an extremely busy woman and she knows a lot about data gathering. Then I welcome my former colleague and friend Daniel Norton. He's an economist at the Marine Institute. He's team lead for the Marine Socioeconomic and Social Data Programme that is supporting marine spatial planning monitoring in Ireland. Danny has worked on a number of ecosystem services assessments projects relating to agriculture, the marine, and as part of the NK, so he really knows how to bring data sets together, and thank you for joining us, Danny. And then Dr. Maeve Henchion, so she's the Principal Research Officer, the Head of the Teagasc Department and Spatial Analysis, an Adjunct Professor at the School of Agriculture and Food Science, UCD. She's involved in identifying new technology, market and value chain opportunities for the Irish industry, understanding consumer, citizen, industry and farmer attitudes. That's a lot of attitudes to try to understand because they're so varied. And she is currently leading research and innovation in the circular bioeconomy, sustainable food production and consumption. I'm going to invite our own friend and colleague, Professor Jane Stout, to join the panel as well, because she will also be commenting. And, you know, just obviously we all know Jane as the international expert that she is, and also sprained ankle at the same time. So she's definitely really pushing out the boat here today. So We have coordinated questions which, arose during our discussions as a group, and, we will be getting some questions coming in online as well, and if we go to time, we will have some time. But at least I thought we might start with you, and, we heard presentations from the National Parks and Wildlife Service and from various research projects from the National Biodiversity Data Centre. So what do you feel that the EPA can learn from other agencies, and what can they learn from the EPA themselves? So,
I think the collaboration and co-designing of solution or data solution is really critical. One is to avoid the duplication and to add value to all the activities that's happening through all the organizations that we've heard today. Some of you who know the research program know that we have kind of a three-layer motto, which is to identify pressure, to inform policy and develop solution. And we're really about delivering open knowledge and open data solution. The one thing that's also important for the EPA is to optimize on the value of all the monitoring, data, assessments, reporting, all that activities. There is a lot that can be done, and that can be also leveraged with other organizations or agencies. In terms of collaboration, for everything which is ecological assessment or habitat protection, it's critical to the work the EPA is trying to do. We can't do it on our own. So it's not just learning from or learning to. Like, we're really leveraging and utilizing the expertise of our colleagues in Parks and Wildlife or other departments or Marine Institute and so on. It's critical for the work that we are doing in terms of our own research projects, to also help us writing our own reports, to provide ecological assessments or put submission as well in some case. Some other type of synergies that does happen on the water protection side. There's been a lot of linkages between the assessment from Parks and Wildlife, Inland Fishery Ireland, for example, the Marine Institute that feeds into the Water Framework Directive, and vice versa. The Water Framework Directive assessment also inform pollution impacts on aquatic ecosystem, which feeds into the Habitat Directive. So it's kind of a two-way system. So the data sharing, and to make sure that we have better way to integrate all this information, not just between agencies, but across the thematic areas. So the water and the biodiversity is really key. And I think you need to look obviously nationally, but also internationally. If you look at the work of the European Environment Agency, they are currently working on that as well in terms of standardizing and harmonizing data. And they're also working towards bringing together the water and the biodiversity knowledge area. So that will be, I think, one key element to look at.
I might cut you off there, Elise, because we want to get around to everybody, but it seems to me this idea of a standardized data platform that would have to be convened between to enable EPA and NPWS, National Biodiversity Data Centre, that doesn't exist. It's just the agency still working in separation rather than...
There are a lot of layers.
Yeah, there are a lot of layers.
I'm not a technical person,
yeah.
So John can help. The system, so some systems do talk to each other. So you will see on the catchments.ai, for example, the EPA maps, there are a lot of layers that are also brought in. So whatever can be brought in is brought in. And the key things, I do believe that spatial data is one big key towards harmonization of data. You're bringing layers together, you're getting an integrated view, and you can do your kind of round-up picture and round-up assessment. Biodiversity Plus, you've mentioned it briefly, is a key activity that's happening at European level. It was mentioned this morning as well. So we, the EPA, are on the partnership as such, but I will really invite everybody that are member of the public, NGOs, private or public, to also look at these activities, because it is 7-year partnerships, and a lot of the work will be looking at monitoring. And for example, we're currently in the process with Parks and Wildlife and the Department of Agriculture as well, to see if we are putting funding towards the next joint call, which will be on monitoring, standardization and harmonization of data. So that is something to also consider. So there is a big part. It's not just joint call funding, I know that's important, but there are also a lot of strategic activities that you could all get involved in, whatever capacity you
Okay, so that's something for everyone here who's interested to check out, really. I'm going to move over to you. Yeah? Can't hear anything. So AV people who are manning the microphones, can you turn up the microphones a bit? Do I have anyone down in the back corner? Or start using the mic?
I'll be grand for this now.
Yeah, well, you see now the force is here now. Daniel Norton, so you have crunched a lot of data sets in your time, I know, and you have many innovative ways of gathering them up. So in terms of the ecosystem accounting with the data that we have, and in the previous session that we had here today on the coastal and the marine, natural capital accounting kept coming up and using the natural capital approach. Where do you feel that we are with the data that we have on that, either from the perspectives that you've had or from the marine?
So I suppose going back to what Lisa, the graphic that Lisa showed in terms of describing natural capital accounting. So you kind of 4 groupings as such, and that's kind of where we're trying to fill in the data gaps. So the extent, we've talked a lot about, mapping the habitats, and John talked about that, and we talked about the land cover maps, and Lisa showed that. Then we talked about condition, and that's where big gaps are, and everybody knows that here, you know what I mean? Like, and then we go into services, and I suppose this is where I come into the project, I suppose, is the gap between what nature is providing for people, the services that's provided, and understanding those, and understanding that relationship. And then they feed into benefits. You know what I mean? Like, so you have a field that's providing biomass, that's cows are feeding, that's providing milk, and we have a large dairy sector. And I suppose that's going back down to, I suppose, as an economist, people think economists think money straight away, but it's not money, it's choices and decisions. And this is where we're talking about John's stuff or other people's data. It should be a two-way street. If you're doing a planning application and you're looking at some species, that data should be going back up into the system. But then, likewise, it should be coming back down to the system that, someone else can see that data, or, if the farmer in the field, he wants to know what kind of condition his area is in, in terms of funding for different schemes, or making his decision, because that's where it's happening. It's happening locally. We've seen that in the last session, where all these small local decisions, they aggregate up, and that's where things are happening. That's where we see the trends. And that's the other thing, that even if we don't have perfect data in this, we can still see trends in gathering the data year after year, and that's one of the things we saw in that project, that we don't have standardised yearly data sets, but if we can see the trends over time, and as we've heard time again, the trend is negative for a lot of biodiversity. You know what I mean? Like, so it's getting them that we can then use the data to make decisions at whatever scale, at local scale, regional scale, national scale. I think that's the important thing, that it's not just a one-way sharing between departments. That's important too, I'm not saying it's not important, but it has to go up from the local at small scale and up to the national, that we can aggregate at the national scale, and then go back down to local so that people can make decisions at that level.
Well, can we just move to Maeve then, because I think there's a good follow-on there. Like, Maeve, you're working in the bioeconomy and, agricultural research. Now, obviously, agriculture is like, it's one huge mega ecosystem service, in terms of providing the biomass and then how we manipulate that and coordinate it. So, like, you're on the agriculture side of the house, and there's others here from the biodiversity side that's really represented here today. So how do you feel that we can work across different agencies to integrate the data use and gathering, and what's your perspective on this conversation?
Maybe I can just step back a little bit, and maybe we need to think in terms of knowledge as opposed to just data. It strikes me we're talking about data for research purposes. I heard talk about time series, quantitative data, and all that is hugely valuable, I think, in terms of the monitoring and research. But I think there was a question, I think it was you asked it, about how can we use that for action? And I think if we can think more broadly about knowledge for transformation, we'll actually think about quite different types of data. And I suppose I'm coming from a social science perspective, recognising the value of qualitative research. We talked about attitudes there, and the diversity of attitudes and the potentially conflicting attitudes and values between the different actors. We were talking about issues about how do we scale up or scale out from different pilots. We need to understand governance issues of trust, and we need to look at good practices. We need to see what is it about these good practices that are successful, and how can they be replicated or transferred to somewhere else. So I think that's looking at it from a more knowledge perspective as opposed to a data perspective. Now, it's for possibly a different objective, but I think if we're to address biodiversity, it's not just about monitoring, and it's not just about research. It is the knowledge that we need for transformation. And I think, just from what my understanding, I think we have an understanding of what we need to do and the challenges, but I think we're possibly looking at data a little bit too narrowly to be trying to get to where we need to go to.
So if you were given the opportunity, I mean, to use that knowledge, how would you make it more open, that flow? Danny talked about the flow up and down and across. How do we achieve that?
That's a very difficult question, and I come from the Biorpic SFI Centre. It's a very big centre, and we're trying to develop a knowledge hub there. And even when you talk about a knowledge hub, you think, oh yeah, I know what that means, but we don't. We've spent ages trying to figure out what do we mean by a knowledge hub for the bioeconomy. Some of it's around data, but some of it's much more, I suppose, fuzzy than that. It's about the networks, and it's about who has the knowledge within the networks, and how can you connect up these people, and thinking about that as the knowledge hub, as opposed to something that's concrete or data driven or tangible even. So it's a bit fuzzier, which is it's much messier in that way. So I don't know, does that make any sense?
No, it makes perfect sense. When I worked in Bordnamona, we had these guys who lived down in the basement. And they had all the knowledge. They had every single bit of knowledge about every plot of land that was ever acquired by Bordnamona. It wasn't data. The data was on the map. But when those guys left, all that knowledge was gone. And now it's just gone. It's not anywhere. It's gone. And on that note, I want to hand over to Jane to comment and maybe synthesize some of those valuable messages. This wasn't rehearsed at all, by the way. So do you think you might be able to pull
Thank you, Catherine.
those together?
I've been trying to sort of process what everybody's been saying, and I think there's some really key themes or some key messages coming out here about what do we need in terms of creating that evidence base and going beyond just numbers and incorporating other kinds of knowledge and data. And one word that's come up an awful lot today has been partnership and working together, sharing data. And I think I'd add to that, just building on what Maeve said, is working across disciplines and not working in our silos. And John was saying, when he's working from a GIS point of view, he needs data in a different way or a different format to the way ecologists are collecting it. So it's about that transdisciplinarity and working across sectors as well as working in partnership, between academia and government agencies and other bodies and of course the experts, the expert amateurs who provide an awful lot of the species level data. So partnership was the first thing, and crossing boundaries and transdisciplinarity was another thing. But then I guess another key theme that's jumped out is in terms of longevity of data, and I think that so in terms of time series, in terms of and not just longevity of data, longevity of knowledge, and just not losing knowledge when the guys in the basement leave, and so we need this continuation of both the data collection, but also we need the continuation of the knowledge, and so that needs resourcing, it needs a supporting and enabling environment. I can't remember who it was that said that we have our researchers on 2 and 3 year contracts.
I think it was Elise.
Elise, there we go. So EPA, we need nice long contracts for our researchers because this is an issue. You build capacity and then people move, and I think this is an issue in the sector at the moment is that there isn't enough capacity, and we don't have enough trained expertise coming through to fill all of the roles that there are going to be over the next few years to address these challenges. So that was the last point really, was in terms of longevity, both of data and knowledge, but also in terms of the capacity, in terms of people, and having a supportive and enabling environment to go from research, from monitoring to action, and the point that was made in the online chat there about what's the effectiveness of that action as well.
I think that's a great synthesis, and I just want to offer the opportunity for one thing from the guys here. Just, you've travelled all this way to be part of a panel, and I gave you a couple of minutes. Is there any one thing that you would like to finish off or say?
I just want to make well, they don't need to, but anyway, just out of the in-case project, we collaborated, talked to so many data people, as Lisa showed there. And one of them was the CSO, and they are starting their ecosystems division, as we said. So out of that, I'm now working in the Marine Institute, and we're looking to transfer some of the lessons in natural capital accounts to marine, which is a different environment, more mobile, more dynamic. And so there's a Coleman Fellowship now in collaboration with the CSO. That's so it is building capacity, but it can happen. Do you mean so? I know we're talking about 2 and 3 year contracts, but these connections that we're making today, that people are meeting here and talking to each other, they'll develop into something else somewhere else, and people go and spread talk. Either on Twitter or in person, whatever. And that's the how it builds forward. That's the network and how it spreads out and how it builds. So I think we should be positive in that nature.
Yeah, and I think you mentioned language, Danny, and when we started to work together, and it was ecologists working with economists, and economists used the word ecosystem in the strangest sense possible, which was not relating to what we thought ecosystem was. And so we had to build that knowledge over and way of speaking. I'd like to open the floor, the questions to the floor, and any burning questions or thoughts. And we do have one from the online people. So, any thoughts on how best to tackle the decline of taxonomic expertise? Maybe that's is it Liam? Do you want to? No. Is that? Anybody want to comment?
I don't think it probably has to be resourced through the National Museum or the Botanic Gardens, and the state needs to invest. I think that the state needs to invest in building that capacity. It's not going to be delivered through academia. But yeah, I would proper resources provided to the museum and to the Botanic Gardens to help build that capacity and retain that capacity within Ireland.
Thank you.
Anyone else from the floor? Yeah, Faith Wilson, Lisa.
We can gather all the data we want, and we can have all these fabulous inventories of habitats and where things are and how badly they're all living. If we don't engage with people on the ground, we're wasting our time. And if we don't have communities galvanised to do something on their patch, be it their bit of grass in their housing estate, or their local river, or their local bat roost, we're at nothing here. And we need more engagement on the ground with people, because people are looking to do something in reaction to the biodiversity crisis, and they don't generally know what to do, and they need our supports. And that, to me, is more critical than endlessly gathering data. And I don't see it happening quickly enough. We need that engagement on the ground, educating people, sharing expertise, winning hearts and minds, because people are keen for it. So I'd welcome anybody to come to the session tomorrow on actions in communities, whether it's a Tidy Towns group, a farmer, a rivers trust, a wetland group. That's where it's actually happening.
Yeah, and just, Faith Wilson is the absolute epitome of someone who goes, and I know I spoke with some of the farmers that she was working with on the Suez project, and that was the first time that someone had engaged with them to explain why a heathland is important, why a blanket bog is important, why you need the species mix. And, Jane, do you want to comment on it? Yeah.
Thanks very much, Faith, and absolutely, I totally agree with you. And I think, the important thing is using the data, the knowledge, the research for action, and just that's been our experience through the All Ireland Pollinator Plan is getting that scientific evidence base, getting that data, making sure that the actions that we are recommending on the ground are evidence based and will work. So yeah, that's absolutely where we need to get to. So thank you.
Okay, so on that note, just a little story. So when I used to have to go and get information about the peatland, or the bog as we really call them, from the lads in the basement, I had to go with plenty of time because the lads in the basement love to have a chat. And there was one particular guy, Tom O'Rourke, who was born on the edge of Esker Bog, and his whole family grew up there, and he was actually the mine of information, and he has left the company since. But I would have to go, park all my plans for the afternoon and spend time and just take time with Tom. And the gold came. And we built a relationship of trust and communication, and we had a mutual respect for the knowledge that we both shared. Me with my doctorate and my science and all this, and Tom, who had actually been out mapping on the ground. And you know, everything we've talked about today, data, knowledge, we need to bring them together. And I think Liam really brought that point out very well and strongly about communication between different agencies, between different data gatherers, and to bring forth the knowledge. And so with that, I want to thank our speakers. You were excellent. Possibly the prize might go to John for the ad-libbing, but I'm not slighting the other speakers. You were fantastic, but come on. And then to our panelists, and you know, we did quite a bit of preparation for this, and I really encourage you to engage with all the speakers and the panelists, and engage with each other and with us after this meeting as well, because it doesn't stop here. It's all very nice to go, aren't you amazing, aren't you brilliant? But we now have to act for nature. So Jane, would you like to say thank you? And yeah.
Just to reiterate those thanks, thank you very much to the speakers, to the panelists. And I think, you know, Catherine mentioned at the end there, what we need is time, and we need time to talk, and what we don't have right now is time. So thank you all for coming to this session this afternoon. Thanks to the speakers, the panelists, and my co-chair, Catherine. And you need to hoof your way down to the other room now for the closing plenary, so thank you.